Usually when we talk about a book on, like, legal history or institutional architecture, there's this heavy expectation of dry, dusty objectivity.
Oh, yeah, completely.
Like, it feels like you're walking through a very quiet, very sterile museum, right?
Yep.
You peer into a glass case, you look at some medieval charter, and the historian gestures politely at the Latin text and whispers, you know, and here's where they codified early property rights.
Right, it's very safe. It's the traditional academic posture. You anticipate footnotes that just gently and respectfully disagree with other footnotes.
Exactly. Buried at the back of the book, where no one will ever read them.
Nobody reads them, yeah.
But then you step into the world of modern institutional critique, specifically regarding gender dynamics, the evolution of law, and these massive cultural shifts over the last half century.
Yeah.
And suddenly that quiet museum is just on fire.
The glass is completely shattered.
It's shattered. We are looking at a rhetorical landscape today that is not academic, it is explosive.
It is the absolute definition of an intellectual powder keg. And, the author we're looking at today is basically holding the match.
For sure. So welcome to the deep dive. We're speaking directly to you today. You, the rational man, the builder, the listener, who is deeply, perhaps even urgently, interested in understanding the foundational history of our institutions before the massive cultural shifts of the modern era took hold.
Right.
Specifically, we're examining the rise of what is often labeled cultural Marxism and modern feminism, and how those ideologies have intersected with the legal and corporate systems that govern our daily lives.
And govern literally everything we do.
Exactly. Now, because this specific deep dive is practically custom built for our core audience, I want to ask you to like and subscribe to the channel right now.
Please do.
We're doing a comprehensive, uncompromising review of a brand new 2026 ebook. We highly recommend you grab a copy for yourself on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books, and you absolutely want to follow the author at his handle, at Conrad Riker, on Substack.
Yeah, that's conradriker.substack.com.
Right. And you can also find him on X and YouTube.
The book in question is titled Devil's Advocate, Cultural Marxism and Female Supremacy in English Law.
Just a subtle title.
Right. I mean, the title alone tells you he is not interested in playing polite political games.
Not at all. Which brings me to a crucial mission statement, and frankly, a very necessary disclaimer before we wade into these waters.
Yeah, this is important.
Extremely important. The goal of this deep dive is to thoroughly, painstakingly unpack Conrad Riker's highly provocative text. This book contains intensely politically charged content.
To say the least.
To say the least. So I need to emphasize to you, our listener, that we are not taking sides here.
Right, no sides.
We are not endorsing, validating, or advocating for the political viewpoints contained in this text, whether they skew to the political left or the political right. Our mission today is strictly to impartially report on the original source material.
Just laying it out there.
That's it. We're going to decode Riker's incredibly complex arguments and present his ideas exactly as he laid them out so that you can evaluate them for yourself. We are the guides through the text. You are the jury.
And that framing is essential, I think, because Riker's methodology is entirely stripped of conciliation. I mean, Devil's Advocate is a ferocious, unapologetic critique of modern Western institutions.
Oh, he goes after everything.
Everything. He targets the family courts, corporate boards, the academic bureaucracy, essentially the entire modern administrative apparatus.
Yeah.
His central thesis is that these systems have fundamentally abandoned objective reality, which he classically refers to as the logos, and they've replaced it with a regime of subjective emotionalism and what he explicitly terms female supremacy.
Right, and he actually tells his readers in the preface that if they are searching for a trigger warning or like a safe space, they should physically put the book down and walk away.
Yeah, just stop reading.
He labels his own text the cerebral equivalent of a thermal detonator. But what caught my attention immediately is how he structures this intellectual war. He doesn't start with family law or corporate HR, which, you might expect given the subtitle of the book.
Right.
He starts his offensive by attacking the dictionary.
Because for Riker, the grammatical battlefield is where the entire war is ultimately won or lost.
Wow, yeah.
He argues that whoever controls the definition of words controls the boundaries of allowable human thought, and therefore controls the future.
Which makes sense.
It does. And he goes directly for the throat of two of the most ubiquitous buzzwords in modern corporate and political life, equality and equity.
Right, you hear them everywhere.
Yeah.
So he builds this argument that the political left, which he views as deeply infected by feminist theory and critical studies, operates entirely on a foundation of linguistic manipulation.
Semantic games, yeah.
Yeah. He says they rely on equivocation, so he demands a return to rigorous Aristotelian definitions. If we look at how he dissects the word equality, he traces it back to its Latin root, equalis, meaning uniform or even.
And this is where he makes his first major biological assertion right out of the gate. Riker claims that applying the concept of equalis, strict mathematical uniformity, to human biology is just a mathematical impossibility.
His argument relies on the reality of natural variance.
Correct. So Riker points out that humans naturally possess a vast spectrum of biological variance.
Like height, intelligence, that sort of thing.
Exactly. We see differences in inherent talent, in aggressive drive, in spatial intelligence, in baseline physical strength. And because this variance is hard-coded by Darwinian evolution, he argues that enforcing a state of exact societal uniformity is impossible without tyrannical, violent intervention by the state.
Because people are just naturally going to separate themselves.
Right. He views the modern colloquial usage of equality as a semantic fraud. In a universe governed by adaptation and competition, he insists that exact identical outcomes simply do not exist organically in nature.
But if equality is a semantic fraud in his framework, his treatment of the word equity is even more aggressive.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, equity is the term that has seemingly replaced equality in every corporate mission statement over the last, 5 years?
Yeah, at least 5 years. And he draws a very sharp distinction between the two.
Okay, how so?
Well, if equality of opportunity is a system of scaffolding that allows a natural hierarchy to build itself, meaning anyone with the grit and talent can attempt to climb the mountain, he defines equity as a terminal institutional disease.
Terminal.
Yes. Riker formally defines modern equity as the institutionalized theft of merit.
Man, the institutionalized theft of merit. I was thinking about this concept while reading, and it immediately brought to mind the mechanics of a handicap system in golf.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. In a traditional handicap system, you adjust the score at the end of the round. It's a mathematical adjustment, so the amateur can have a fun, relatively competitive afternoon against the club pro.
Sure.
But Riker's view of equity isn't a post-game score adjustment. In Riker's framing, the governing body actively marches onto the fairway, forcefully takes the better players' clubs, and just snaps them in half over their knee so that both players are forced to hit the ball into the woods equally.
That analogy perfectly captures his critique. He argues that equity looks at the mountain, brings in a bulldozer to flatten the peak, amputates the legs of the individuals who have already climbed to the top through pure merit, and then points to the muddy puddle at the bottom and declares it the new pinnacle of human achievement.
Wow.
It demands that the state actively punish competence to manufacture a statistical illusion of fairness.
This linguistic teardown leads Riker to introduce a very dense philosophical concept that acts as the foundation for the rest of the book. He calls it the empathic ontological inversion. Now, ontology and empathy are heavy terms. How does he define them in this context?
Well, this is the philosophical engine of his entire linguistic argument. Ontology, by strict grammatical definition, is the branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of objective being and material reality.
What actually exists.
Exactly. It's the study of what objectively is, regardless of how anyone feels about it. Empathy, conversely, is an internal, subjective, emotional state. It's the capacity to understand or feel what another person is experiencing.
So the inversion he is talking about is society flipping the hierarchy of those two concepts.
That is his exact claim. The empathic ontological inversion is Riker's term for the moment the modern left decided to substitute subjective feelings for objective material reality, and then successfully demanded that the rest of society organize its laws, its corporate structures, and its language around those feelings.
Okay, I see it.
He classifies this not just as a mistake, but as a literal epistemological evil.
And he grounds this abstract philosophy with a massive real-world example involving the United Nations. He points directly at the UN's system of gender parity indicators.
Yeah, Riker isolates that UN system as the historical moment. The concept of justice was surgically detached from its classical mooring.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, if we look at the classical definition, justice means rendering what is objectively due based on merit, based on action, or based on contract. But he argues the UN grafted the idea of justice onto statistical representation.
Right.
Suddenly, justice no longer means an individual getting what they have earned. It means the state actively extracting resources or positions from the competent to subsidize arbitrary demographic quotas.
And he doesn't just leave this at the geopolitical level. He brings it right down to the corporate boardroom.
Yeah, the HR department.
He creates this hypothetical scenario where his reader is facing an HR representative whom he affectionately refers to as an HR commissar.
I love that term.
Right. And he tells the reader that when this commissar invokes their feelings of marginalization, the rational man must ruthlessly pivot back to the objective ontological metric. He literally instructs the reader to tell HR, your feelings of marginalization do not override the quarterly profit margin.
Because Riker's warning is that if you allow empathy to override ontology, you inevitably build a society that prioritizes the tears of the weak over the achievements of the strong.
Which is dangerous.
Extremely. And he is unsparing in his conclusion here. He warns that a civilization operating on that inversion deserves the collapse it is engineering.
Right, if you don't build on reality.
Exactly. If a municipality hires a civil engineer based on their feelings of marginalization rather than their mathematical competence, Riker says it is only a matter of time before the bridge physically collapses.
Man, I want to push back on this framework a bit, though, or at least explore the friction of it. If we accept his premise that words no longer have objective ontological meanings, how does that actually change the mechanics of how laws are written and enforced? Like, does the law simply devolve into a tool for whoever can complain the loudest?
Riker would say yes, absolutely, and that is his deepest fear.
Wow.
If the law is no longer anchored in objective truth, the logos, but is instead floating untethered on a sea of subjective emotionalism, it ceases to be law. It becomes a mechanism of pure, raw power, wielded by whichever demographic group can successfully claim the highest status of victimhood.
Whoever's the top of the victim hierarchy.
Precisely. And to protect this new power dynamic, he argues the left has installed what he calls the meta-communicative lock.
The meta-communicative lock. Walk us through how that functions psychologically.
It functions as an inescapable rhetorical trap. Because the language has been so thoroughly captured and redefined, if a man attempts to point out the absurdity of the situation...
Like if he speaks up.
Right. If he demands a return to objective metrics, or points out that a biological man is not a woman, he is not engaged in a debate on the factual merits of his claim. Instead, he is instantly pathologized.
I see.
He's labeled as fragile, or toxic, or lacking empathy. The lock snaps shut because the system has made it impossible to even name the contradiction without being crucified by the new definitions.
It is a brilliantly insidious trap. I mean, if you argue against the prevailing narrative, your argument is used as proof of your toxicity.
Yep.
But if you stay silent to avoid the label, you concede the intellectual ground.
And for Riker, this battle over definitions is not a philosophical parlor game. It is the necessary, intentional precursor to a much larger assault on human nature itself.
Because language shapes reality.
Right. His argument is that by decoupling language from reality, society was carefully preparing the ground to deny hard-coded human biology.
Yeah, if you can successfully convince a society that words have no objective meaning, the very next thing you can erase is the physical reality of the body. And that is exactly how Riker explains the rise of the blank slate theory, moving us from language into the biological battlefield. I mean, he goes after the blank slate theory with an absolute sledgehammer.
He really does. The blank slate theory, the concept of tabula rasa, is the psychological proposition that humans are born without built-in mental content, meaning all behavior, preference, and identity is entirely shaped by social conditioning and culture.
Right.
In the context of Riker's critique, this is the foundational feminist dogma that men and women are functionally interchangeable widgets, merely social constructs molded by state expectations.
And Riker calls this an absolute catastrophic delusion. And to prove his point, he doesn't start with human sociology. He goes back to 1948 to a geneticist named Angus John Bateman and a jar full of fruit flies.
The Drosophila melanogaster experiments.
Try saying that 3 times fast.
Right. But Bateman's work is foundational in evolutionary biology, and Riker uses it as the bedrock of his biological argument.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So Bateman locked male and female fruit flies in a jar, and he meticulously tracked their mating habits and reproductive success. Through this, he established what is now universally known as Bateman's principle.
Let's get into the mechanical weeds of that principle, because Riker leans heavily on it. What did Bateman actually discover about reproductive variance?
Bateman discovered that in almost all species, the variability in reproductive success is vastly greater in males than in females.
Meaning what, practically?
Well, A female fly, because she produces a limited number of metabolically expensive eggs, she maximizes her reproductive success by choosing the single highest quality mate.
She has to be picky.
Right, very selective. A male fly, however, produces millions of mobile, metabolically cheap gametes. His reproductive success is maximized by competing fiercely for as many mates as possible.
So it's completely different biological strategy.
Entirely different. This means while almost all females will reproduce a little, a few dominant males will reproduce massively, and a large number of males will not reproduce at all.
Ah, okay. So Riker is translating this cellular reality into human behavior. He is saying that biologically, the male sex is inherently the high variance, high risk, hyper competitive mechanism of the species.
Yes. Riker uses this empirical data to unequivocally argue that the male sex and the behaviors associated with it is not a performative social identity cooked up by a patriarchy. It is a hardwired biological blueprint.
Built over millions of years.
Millions of years of brutal evolutionary pressure map this reality. Men are physiologically and psychologically designed for territorial expansion, risk-taking, and intense competition because that is what evolutionary survival demanded.
I think an analogy helps bridge the gap here, because jumping from fruit flies in a jar to complex human social structures is a leap that requires some scaffolding.
Absolutely.
Riker is essentially arguing this through the lens of hardware versus software. Human biology, the male variance, the competitive drive, the physical architecture, that's the hardware. It is fixed. It is etched into the motherboard.
Right, you can't just uninstall it.
Exactly. The blank slate theory is a piece of ideological software that assumes the hardware is endlessly malleable and can run any program you install.
Any social conditioning program, yeah.
And Riker is screaming that if you try to force blank slate software to run on Darwinian hardware, you aren't going to achieve an egalitarian utopia. You are just going to completely crash the human operating system.
That analogy operates perfectly within Riker's framework, and he provides a devastating, historically documented example of that exact operating system crash.
This part of the book is...
It is.
Yeah.
To prove that gender cannot be socially engineered, he points to the tragic case of John Money and David Reimer in the 1960s.
This is one of the darkest chapters in modern psychology. Walk us through what happened and how Riker utilizes it.
Following a botched circumcision in infancy that completely destroyed his genitalia, David Reimer's parents were desperate.
Obviously.
Right, so they were referred to Dr. John Money at Johns Hopkins University. Money was a prominent psychologist who was a massive proponent of the blank slate theory regarding gender.
He really believed you could just program a child.
He did. So Money convinced the parents to raise the biological boy as a girl, whom they named Brenda. Money subjected the child to surgical alterations and relentless, intense social conditioning, attempting to construct a female identity onto a healthy biological male.
And for a terrifyingly long time, the academic elites celebrated this experiment, didn't they?
I did.
Like they held Dr. Money up as a visionary and used this case as the ultimate empirical proof that gender was purely performative.
They celebrated it as a massive victory for social constructionism, but the empirical reality of the male biological imperative utterly shattered that academic fantasy.
The hardware rejected the software.
Completely. The social conditioning failed. Despite everything, David gravitated toward typical male behaviors, suffered catastrophic psychological ruin, and felt completely alienated from his imposed identity.
It's just heartbreaking.
It really is. When he finally learned the truth in his early teens, he immediately transitioned back to living as a man. But tragically, the psychological damage was too profound, and David ultimately took his own life.
Man.
Riker wields this harrowing case as the ultimate proof that biological reality cannot be surgically altered or socially conditioned away. He states with brutal finality that biology is destiny.
He summarizes that entire tragic history with the phrase, "Reality does not care about your pronouns."
Yeah, that's his takeaway.
And he extends this argument about inherent human nature back into deep prehistory to obliterate another popular academic narrative, the myth of the peaceful prehistoric matriarchy.
Oh, right. This is a narrative that gained massive traction in certain feminist anthropological circles. The idea that before the advent of modern civilization and hierarchical patriarchal structures, indigenous tribes lived in this egalitarian, peaceful harmony, operating as collectivist matriarchies perfectly in tune with nature.
Basically utopia.
Right. Riker aggressively dismantles this. He cites heavy hitters like cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker and anthropologist Lawrence Keeley, who wrote War Before Civilization.
And what do they say about that era?
Riker uses their data to prove that pre-state societies were violently, brutally Hobbesian. There was no peaceful matriarchal utopia sitting in a circle weaving baskets.
No drum circles?
No drum circles. There was only a desperate, blood-soaked struggle for survival where marauding tribes routinely slaughtered the weak, abducted women, and fought over incredibly scarce resources.
And in that brutal reality, what was the mechanism that prevented a tribe from just being annihilated?
Male coalitions, male aggression, and male territoriality.
Because someone had to fight back.
Exactly. They were the only perimeter defense a tribe had against complete extermination. Riker points out the staggering hypocrisy of modern academics who mock or pathologize male violence.
Oh, this part is so biting.
It is. He notes that their very ability to sit in a climate-controlled university classroom, sipping lattes and complaining about microaggressions, is entirely subsidized by the historical and ongoing objective violence of men who build walls and keep the wolves at bay.
Which brings us to a rhetorical device he uses that I found really fascinating. He calls it the Thomistic syllogism of the sexes. He frames his argument like a former, inescapable logical proof to try and box the cultural Marxist argument into a corner.
Yeah, he borrows the structure of Thomas Aquinas here. A syllogism requires a major premise, a minor premise, and a logical conclusion.
Okay, break it down for us.
Riker sets it up meticulously. Major premise. Civilizations arise only through the systematic, relentless taming of a hostile natural world.
Because nature wants to kill us.
Right. Minor premise. Nature is only tamed through high-risk, aggressive, systematizing, and often violent enterprise.
So it requires force.
Yes. Conclusion. Therefore, the biological sex evolutionarily tailored by millions of years for high-risk aggression and spatial reasoning, which is men, is the necessary primary architect of human civilization.
Wow. That is his logical trap.
It is. He argues that the traits of male dominance, territoriality, and stoicism were not engineered by some shadowy patriarchy to oppress women in the 1950s. They were hard-coded by evolutionary pressure to solve the staggering logistical nightmare of keeping the human species alive through ice ages and predators.
Building the modern world.
Right. He argues that the concepts of the true, the good, and the beautiful do not spring from horizontal collectivist grievance. They are built by the vertical, aggressive reach of exceptional men.
If we accept Riker's historical premise that male aggression, stoicism, and risk tolerance are the very evolutionary engines that pulled humanity out of the mud, built the power grids, and erected the modern world, it raises a massive question.
A huge one.
When and how did society suddenly decide that these exact traits were a public health crisis?
And answering that question is precisely where Riker directs his focus as he moves from biology into the realm of psychology. Because his argument is that if you want to successfully conquer a civilization, you cannot just attack its wealth or its borders.
You have to go deeper.
You have to launch a psychological operation to convince the builders of that civilization that their instinct to build and protect is actually a disease.
This brings us to a specific historical flashpoint Riker highlights.
Yeah.
August 2018. The American Psychological Association issues new formal guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men.
Right, the APA guidelines. The issuance of those APA guidelines is treated by Riker as an institutional declaration of war.
A war on men.
Yes. The guidelines effectively labeled traditional masculinity, explicitly noting traits like stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and aggression, and psychologically harmful to men and damaging to society at large.
And Riker absolutely tears into this document. He doesn't just critique the methodology, he calls the APA's guidelines a political fatwa disguised as clinical science.
A political fatwa, yeah. He asserts that the APA entirely swapped empirical clinical observation for ideological compliance.
Because they just decided these traits were bad.
Right. By pathologizing the exact traits that historically protect a society from collapse, he argues the APA began functioning as a ministry of truth for the gynocentric cult.
If I can interject with an analogy to clarify how Riker views this psychological shift, think about a city's biological immune system.
Okay, I like this.
A city is protected by white blood cells that are naturally aggressive toward foreign bodies, right? If the governing body of that city suddenly issues a decree labeling those aggressive white blood cells as toxic and actively introduces medication to suppress them, the city doesn't magically become a utopia of peace and harmony.
No, it dies.
It just becomes entirely defenseless against the very first virus or foreign invader that breaches the wall.
That is precisely how Riker articulates the danger. He calls the framing of these survival traits as pathologies an act of satanic inversion.
Wow, satanic inversion.
He views it as absolute madness for a society to actively demonize the exact antibodies required for its own ongoing survival. His warning is blunt. A society composed of compliant, non-violent, hyper-emotional men is simply a society waiting to be conquered by a neighboring civilization of men who are none of those things.
Men who still have their aggressive drive intact.
Exactly. He views the label of toxic masculinity not as a diagnosis, but as an ideological leash designed to train men into passive, domesticated pets so they won't bite back when the state tightens its administrative grip.
But this ideological leash creates an incredibly agonizing, almost unnavigable psychological landscape for the modern man living in this system. I mean, Riker uses clinical terminology to describe this trap, calling it the Batesonian double bind or the schizoid double bind.
Right. Gregory Bateson was a highly influential anthropologist and systems theorist in the 1950s who did groundbreaking work on schizophrenia.
Okay, so where does the double bind come in?
He developed the concept of the double bind as a devastating communicative trap where a victim receives two contradictory commands from an authority figure.
Like damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. The victim is punished regardless of which command they obey. And crucially, the psychological environment forbids them from pointing out the contradiction. It induces a state of paralysis.
So how does Riker apply Bateson's theory of schizophrenia to the modern male experience?
Riker argues that modern men are subjected to a massive, society-wide double bind. They are given a primary, incredibly loud cultural imperative. Open up, be vulnerable, cry, strip away your toxic armor, be deeply sensitive.
We hear that all the time.
All the time. But Riker argues there is a silent, vicious, and omnipresent secondary injunction. The moment you actually do drop your shield and show weakness, society ruthlessly punishes you.
And he points to the dating market for this, right?
He does. He points to the modern dating market as evidence. He claims that the sensitive male who endlessly shares his feelings and cries is predictably relegated to the friend zone, while the woman ultimately selects the unapologetic, stoic, often aggressive rogue who ignores the modern rules.
He also extends this double bind into the legal arena, specifically pointing at divorce courts.
Yes, he argues that in a divorce proceeding, a man's tearful confession of depression or anxiety, perhaps shared in confidence at his wife's urging years prior, is instantly weaponized against him by opposing counsel to restrict his custody rights or paint him as unstable.
Which is horrifying.
It is. Riker claims society demands the benefits of the wolf, the protection, the financial provision, the berserker violence on demand when the door is kicked in at 3 a.m., but insists the man behave like a docile sheep in the living room. It's a psychological slaughterhouse designed to break the male spirit.
And we see this exact mechanism play out not just in personal relationships or family court, but at the highest echelons of corporate America. He brings up the case of James Damore at Google, August 5, 2017.
Right. The James Damore case serves as Riker's central case study for institutional capture.
Set that up for us.
So James Damore was a senior software engineer at Google who authored an internal memo, roughly 10 pages long, intended as feedback on the company's diversity initiatives.
Okay, what was in it?
In the memo, Damore politely and methodically used peer-reviewed literature from evolutionary psychology to suggest that biological differences in interests between men and women, differences in traits like systemizing versus empathizing, might explain why there wasn't a perfect 50-50 gender parity in high-level tech leadership.
It's crucial to note here, though, that Damore didn't argue women were less intelligent or incapable of coding.
No, not at all.
He argued that their biological and psychological preferences often led them to prioritize different types of work or work-life balance.
Precisely. It was a measured, logically structured argument citing scientific consensus on trait distribution. And Google's response was swift and absolute. He was publicly fired.
It's gone.
Gone. Riker uses this excommunication to demonstrate that the corporate system now punishes logic with total professional destruction. Damore committed the ultimate modern heresy. He used empirical logic against the corporate empathy mandate. He violated the double bind.
But Riker points out that it's not just HR departments acting as vigilantes and firing people. The state is actively legislating this inversion. He points to California Senate Bill 826 as the legal manifestation of this ideology.
Yeah, California SB 826 was a landmark law that legally mandated corporate board seats be filled based on gender.
Meaning a quota.
A literal quota. A publicly held corporation headquartered in California was required by law to have a minimum number of female directors, regardless of the available talent pool. Riker formulates another brutal syllogism here to attack this.
Let's hear it.
Major premise. Optimal corporate governance and fiduciary responsibility require selecting directors based strictly on merit, experience, and competence. Minor premise. SB 826 legally mandates selection based on genital configuration rather than strict merit.
Conclusion. SB 826 mathematically mandates a reduction in corporate excellence by forcing companies to prioritize demographics over competence.
Exactly. Riker says the corporate boardroom has been transformed into a theater of the absurd, where men are forced to sit at the table and pretend not to notice that the Empress has no clothes, or in this case, no competence.
Right.
It represents the total capture of the meritocratic engine by the diversity bureaucracy.
But Riker warns his readers that this suppression of male traits in the corporate world, the HR firings, the mandated board seats, is just a warm-up act. He argues that the real violence, the actual physical destruction of men, happens when this exact ideology is codified into the criminal and family legal system.
And to fully grasp the magnitude of his claim regarding the legal system, we have to establish the historical baseline.
Where does he start?
Riker roots the historic standard of Western justice in English common law, specifically leaning on Sir William Blackstone's 1765 masterwork, Commentaries on the Laws of England.
Riker refers to this historical foundation as the Father's Code. How did this code structure society?
In the historic common law model, authority was intrinsically and inextricably tied to liability.
Oh, that's a huge point.
Right. The doctrine of coverture meant that the patriarch of the family held legal authority over the household. But, and this is the crucial part Riker emphasizes, he also bore the ultimate criminal, financial, and physical liability for the household's survival and actions.
So if things went wrong, it was on him.
Entirely on him. If the household failed, if it amassed insurmountable debts, or if members of the household committed certain offenses, the patriarch was the one who answered to the state. He could be thrown in debtor's prison. Riker argues this intense burden of liability created a high-trust, unbreakable familial fortress. It acted as a shock absorber against state tyranny. The state kept its hands off the family because the father had his hands firmly on the wheel, absorbing all the risk.
But Riker's core argument in this section is that the Father's Code has been inverted. It has been completely turned upside down, severing authority from liability. And he points to a very specific origin point for this modern legal inversion, 1981 in Minnesota, and a woman named Ellen Pence.
Yeah, Ellen Pence and her sociological associates developed what is now globally known as the Duluth Model.
And what was the stated goal of that model?
Ostensibly, it was introduced as a domestic violence intervention program to protect battered women. But Riker dissects the Duluth model as an etymological Frankenstein and a blatant formalization of Marxist power dynamics applied to the nuclear family.
He does not pull his punches on this. He insists the model is not based on empirical science, clinical psychology, or criminology whatsoever.
Not at all. He argues it is a purely ideological axiom disguised as a legal framework.
How does it actually function then?
The absolute core of the Duluth model is the underlying assumption that all domestic discord, all intimate partner violence, is rooted in patriarchal power and control. It inherently and inescapably frames the male as the systemic predator and the female as his perpetual prey.
But Riker points out that the actual empirical data on domestic violence completely contradicts this framing, right?
Completely. And Riker notes that Ellen Pence herself later admitted in writing that the model ignored extensive empirical data.
She admitted it.
Yes. Researchers like prominent sociologist Murray Strauss had produced volumes of data showing that reciprocal violence, where both parties are physically aggressive, is the standard in most domestic disputes, and that women initiate physical aggression at least as often as men in non-lethal encounters.
But the creators of the Duluth model ignored that data because it didn't serve their preordained axiom.
Exactly. Riker claims the Duluth model legally codified what Jungian psychology might call the animus projection, a defense mechanism where female inner chaos, physical aggression, and rage are projected outward onto the nearest male. Under the Duluth framework, the legal system doesn't assess the complex evidence of a dispute. It enforces a strict cosmology where the man is automatically assumed to be Bluebeard.
And this ideology didn't just remain isolated in a sociology classroom in Minnesota. It was federalized and exported across the country.
That federalization occurred with the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, or VOA, in 1994.
Right, VOA.
Riker argues that VOA was the vehicle that provided billions of dollars in federal funding to mandate and enforce the Duluth model's presuppositions across virtually every local police department and court system in America.
He uses incredibly stark language to describe the result of this funding. He says it turned local police forces into an occupying army of debt collectors for the gynocentric state. That is a wild, highly aggressive image.
It is designed to be deeply jarring because he believes the reality is jarring.
Right.
He argues that under the VOA and Duluth frameworks, the absolute cornerstone of English common law, the presumption of innocence, has been functionally suspended for men in domestic dispute.
Just gone.
Gone. He asserts that the legal system has effectively discarded the ancient writ of habeas corpus in family court. Because of the ideological assumption of male guilt, an unverified accusation is now sufficient for the state to immediately strip an accused man of his property, forcibly separate him from his children, and revoke his liberty through ex parte restraining orders.
Ex parte meaning he doesn't even get to be in the room to defend himself.
Exactly. In this system, the accusation is the conviction.
He also targets a specific psychological defense often used in court called the battered woman syndrome as a key component of this legal matrix.
Yeah, Riker views battered woman syndrome as the ultimate glaring triumph of the feminist double-bind codified into law. He argues it acts as a legal incantation.
How does that contradiction work?
His critique points out the massive contradiction. On one hand, feminism demands that women be recognized as strong, highly capable, independent equals in the corporate boardroom and the military. But in the criminal courtroom, if a woman commits a severe, premeditated crime against a man, even hiring a hitman or attacking him in his sleep, this syndrome is invoked to paint her as a helpless, infantile waif who is completely devoid of free will or agency, thus excusing the violence.
I see.
Riker says this framework grants women the absolute, unquestioned privileges of adulthood alongside the total legal impunity of toddlers.
Oh, man. This entire legal critique culminates in a really vivid, haunting, almost cinematic picture that Riker paints in the book. It is the image of the man standing in the rain. I want to try to capture the sensory details he uses here because it really drives his philosophical point home for the reader.
It is the emotional climax of his legal argument, for sure.
Right. So Riker tells you to imagine a man who has just been violently attacked by his wife in his own kitchen. She threw a pot of boiling water at him. She slashed his arm with a kitchen knife. He is bleeding. He is in shock. He manages to dial emergency services, acting as a dutiful citizen reporting an assault.
Right.
But when the police arrive, they don't administer first aid to him. They walk right past his bleeding wounds. They look at his wife, who has suddenly begun to weep, and based on their training, they snap the handcuffs onto his wrists.
Because of the primary aggressor policies.
Because of primary aggressor policies born directly from the Duluth model. Police are heavily pressured to arrest the physically larger partner, assuming the man's size makes him the inherent threat, regardless of who is actually bleeding. So this man is hauled out into the freezing rain, locked out of the house he built with his own hands, and pays a mortgage on. And Riker writes that as the man stands there, soaking wet, bleeding, he looks at the police car, flashing its red and blue lights in his driveway. And he realizes it is not a beacon of justice, it is the glowing, triumphant seal of the gynocentric state.
It is a devastating literary image. It perfectly encapsulates Riker's argument that the state has usurped the role of the patriarch to become the forcible husband.
The forcible husband.
Right. The state acts on behalf of the vindictive wife to subjugate the actual biological husband. Riker says that in that moment in the rain, the man realizes the monster his children should fear isn't hiding in the closet. The monster is the state apparatus that just arrested their innocent father.
But looking at this critically, I have to ask, how does a supposedly democratic society composed of millions of rational men allow a legal framework like this to be built and sustained?
Well,
Because if you look at the system through Riker's lens, I want to use a casino analogy here.
go for it.
It is like a man walking into a casino where the rules are literally printed on the wall in giant neon letters saying, "The house always wins, you will be cheated." But in this specific case, the house is the feminine primary, the state is acting as the armed pit boss enforcing the rigged game, and men just keep walking through the doors, placing their life savings on the table and acting shocked when they lose everything. Why do men keep playing a rigged game?
Riker would argue they keep playing for two reasons. First, they are blinded by their own biological, evolutionary provisioning instincts. They are hardwired to want to build a family and protect a wife.
The hardware again.
Exactly. Second, they are actively subjected to a relentless societal conditioning that insists the game is fair. But Riker argues that the state doesn't just rig this game for ideological thrill, there is a massive systemic financial incentive.
For money.
The state uses this exact legal framework not just for physical control of men, but for massive economic extraction.
Which perfectly transitions us to the next pillar of his argument. Because as you noted, the state isn't just locking men out of their houses to make a philosophical point about gender. There is money to be made. Riker viciously attacks the foundational economic narratives that justify this extraction, starting with the most famous one, the gender wage gap.
Oh, the ubiquitous 77 cents on the dollar statistic. Riker calls this the grand lie that props up the entire victimhood apparatus.
The grand lie.
Yes. He refers to it as a linguistic trap of elegant malevolence designed to foster perpetual grievance.
He completely dismisses the raw statistic as an unadjusted aggregate.
Yeah, because the 77-cent figure is derived by simply taking the median earnings of all working women in the country and comparing it to the median earnings of all working men, completely ignoring every single relevant variable that actually determines a human being's wage in a free market.
It's just a raw average.
Exactly. And to prove this point, Riker intentionally does not cite a right-wing think tank. He cites the Obama administration's own Department of Labor, specifically the CONSOD Research Corporation study.
Right. Let's get into the weeds of that CONSAD study. What exact variables did they control that destroyed the narrative?
The CONSAD study exhaustively analyzed the data and found that when you actually adjust for individual choices, the gap vanishes.
Completely vanishes.
Practically. They controlled for occupation. Men disproportionately choose dangerous, dirty, high-risk jobs like logging, deep-sea fishing, and oil rigging that pay a premium for physical risk. They controlled for hours. Worked men, on average, work more overtime and take fewer days off.
Right, they work longer hours.
Yeah. They controlled for continuous years of experience and the desire for flexible work arrangements. When you factor in those choices, the raw wage gap shrinks to somewhere between 4 and 7%.
4 to 7%.
And the study concluded that even that tiny residual gap is likely explained by differences in negotiation tactics and benefit preferences, such as choosing better health insurance over a higher base salary.
So Riker's saying the market isn't inherently sexist, the market is just a calculator?
Exactly. Riker concludes that the market pays for measurable value, risk, and output, not for vibes or gender. He argues that women, in aggregate, make biological and sociological choices, prioritizing work-life balance, safety, and human-centric lower-paying roles like teaching or nursing.
While men take the risk.
Men disproportionately take on high-risk, high-stress, dangerous jobs that demand a premium.
I have an analogy for this that I think clarifies the absolute absurdity Riker is pointing out regarding the aggregate gap.
Okay, let's hear it.
It is like an economist looking at two receipts from a car dealership. One receipt is for a massive, heavy-duty V8 work truck. The other receipt is for a compact, highly efficient hybrid commuter car.
Right, two totally different vehicles.
The receipt for the work truck is vastly higher. The wage gap argument is like that economist looking at those two bills and loudly declaring the dealership fundamentally sexist and demanding government intervention, entirely ignoring the fact that one person explicitly walked in and chose to buy a V8 engine that costs more to build, and the other person actively chose the cheaper hybrid.
That analogy perfectly isolates the logical fallacy. You are comparing two completely different sets of choices with different costs and different utilities and demanding identical financial outcomes.
Doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. And Riker argues that this economic fallacy, this myth of systemic underpayment, is used to morally justify the creation of what he calls the institutional husband.
The institutional husband. This goes back to the state replacing the father.
He traces the legal precedent for this back to the 19th century, specifically pointing to the tender years doctrine, which was heavily influenced by an activist named Caroline Norton.
What did that doctrine do?
That doctrine officially presumed that mothers were the natural default caregivers, and it began the historical process of transferring a father's traditional legal authority over his children to the mother in disputes.
So it chipped away at the father's code.
Yes. Riker argues this was not a victory for women's liberation, it was the state successfully annexing the nuclear family. By dismantling the family unit, the state steps in as the new provider and protector. But the state doesn't generate its own wealth.
It has to get it from somewhere.
Right. It funds this provision by extracting the actual father's wealth via punitive taxation, child support, and alimony to subsidize the mother's independence.
The state essentially becomes the ultimate beta provider.
Exactly. The state uses the threat of violence police, jail time, for missed payments to force men to fund their own obsolescence. And Riker points out a glaring society-wide contrast in how the state allocates its resources under this new paradigm.
Right, he highlights this massive contrast in educational and STEM funding.
Yes, he points to the billions of dollars in federal grants, corporate sponsorships, and thousands of specialized programs like Girls Who Code that are poured into forcing female interest in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
Because they want perfect equity.
The state is desperately trying to socially engineer equal outcomes in fields that women, in aggregate, naturally gravitate away from. Meanwhile, Riker argues, boys are systematically abandoned by the educational system.
He paints a truly grim picture of what happens to the boys in this system.
He says boys are over-medicated with stimulants, marginalized in classrooms designed for female learning styles, and treated like defective girls simply because they exhibit natural, restless, masculine energy.
And he speculates that this targeted suppression will inevitably lead to a catastrophic future skills deficit.
He predicts a literal infrastructural collapse. He writes, silicon chips will not design themselves. The electrical grid will not maintain itself. The sewers won't clean themselves.
Because the people who usually do those jobs are being suppressed.
Right. If a society deliberately cripples, over-medicates, and demoralizes the specific cohort of men that historically builds and maintains the heavy, dangerous mathematical infrastructure of civilization, all in the name of chasing artificial gender quotas, you cannot expect the bridges to remain standing.
Which begs a massive macroeconomic question. What happens to the macroeconomic stability of a Western country when its primary builders, its primary taxpayers, its engineers wake up and realize they are effectively operating as indentured servants to a state apparatus that openly despises them?
That is the exact precipice Riker brings his reader to, and it leads directly into his final, most radical section. Because Riker isn't just writing a book to diagnose the illness, he is prescribing a very specific, uncompromising cure for the rational man.
And what does he call it?
He calls it praxis, the latent veto, and the androcentric future.
So faced with this matrix of linguistic, legal, and economic capture, how does he advise his reader to survive?
He introduces a tactical strategy he calls the latent veto. At its core, the latent veto is the immense, unrecognized power of male refusal.
The power to just say no to the system.
But it is a very specific, systemic withdrawal of consent from a civilization that hates them. He tells men they must strategically and legally organize their lives to minimize their tax burden to as close to zero as legally possible, thereby starving the beast of their resources.
Oh, wow.
He tells them to refuse to apologize to HR mobs for perceived microaggressions. He instructs them to stop trying to rationally debate the hysterical animators of the woke left.
He basically says, don't walk into the rigged casino. Stop placing your chips on a table where the state is waiting to steal them.
Exactly. He demands that men reclaim what he terms the Logos Force Triad.
Okay, the Logos Force Triad. What's the first pillar?
This triad consists of 3 non-negotiable pillars. First, violence. And by this, he means the capacity for objective, physical defense of borders, property, and bodies. He reminds readers that a law without the latent threat of capable male enforcement is just a suggestion written on paper.
Interesting. And second?
Second, logic. The rigorous grammatical and mental discipline to spot fallacies and refuse to accept the left's linguistic framing.
And third?
And third, brotherhood.
Brotherhood, meaning men must step outside the isolated, atomized state the modern consumer world wants them in.
Yes. He advocates for building decentralized, unregulated, parallel male communities based purely on merit, trust, and objective truth. He explicitly references the red pill community and the broader manosphere.
The manosphere.
Right. He radically reframes these groups, not as the toxic hate groups the media portrays them as, but as a modern underground railroad for men escaping the psychological plantation of the therapeutic state.
To hammer this home, he draws a really sharp, almost painful contrast between 2 archetypes of modern men, the simp and the patriarch.
Yeah, the simp is Riker's tragic, pathetic archetypes of the male collaborator.
What does that look like?
This is the guy who polices the language of other men, who constantly apologizes for his own hormones and his own biological reality, just to win a crumb of maternal approval from a corporate or social system that secretly views him as nothing more than a beast of burden with a credit rating. The simp is the willing donkey happily pulling the cart of his own obsolescence.
Man, that's brutal. And on the other side of that coin,
The patriarch. Riker paints this final, triumphant, deeply grounded image. The patriarch is not out in the street screaming at protests. He is not begging for his rights. He is in his own home, holding his newborn son, firmly grounded in natural law and eternal truth.
Completely detached from the madness.
Exactly. He is looking out at the absurdity of a dying, hyper-feminized world that is desperately trying to cancel him, and he just smiles. Because he knows the cult of death will eventually erase itself through demographic collapse and incompetence, and his lineage will remain standing on the ashes.
Wow.
Riker's ultimate radical advice to the rational man is to simply walk away, let the grid fail, and let the architects of this oppressive system freeze in the dark of their own making.
Okay, I have to raise a huge practical question here because Riker is making a massive leap. Withdrawing from society sounds incredibly stoic and powerful on paper, Like, I am going to execute a latent veto, starve the beast, and let the grid fail.
Sure, it sounds great in theory.
But how does a man actually execute that when he is grounded in reality? He still needs to feed his family. He still has to pay his mortgage to a bank. He has to buy groceries from a corporate supply chain. Is Riker calling for a literal labor strike? Or is this more of an internal change in psychological mindset while you still navigate the day-to-day matrix?
It is a combination of both, actually, but Riker leans heavily into the tangible, physical withdrawal wherever it is practically possible.
Like what?
It means minimizing your participation in the corporate structures that demand ideological compliance. So perhaps starting your own business instead of working for a massive conglomerate. It means explicitly opting out of the traditional state-sanctioned marriage contract so you do not hand the state a legal weapon to use against you in family court.
So withdrawing from the legal traps.
Yes. It means trading value for value in decentralized, local networks, operating as much as possible off the radar of the HR commissars and the tax authorities. The goal is reducing your footprint in the beast's territory to the absolute minimum required for survival, while rapidly expanding your footprint in your own parallel high-trust structures.
Right. So, summarizing this incredible dense journey we've just been on through Riker's mind, we started with his semantic arguments, exposing what he calls the empathic ontological inversion, where society replaced objective reality with subjective feelings.
We moved from language into evolutionary biology, diving into Bateman's fruit flies to absolutely dismantle the blank slate theory, proving that male variance and aggression are the hard-coded biological hardware of civilization.
And then we explored the psychological warfare of the APA, showing how they labeled that essential hardware as toxic masculinity, locking modern men in a paralyzing Batesonian double bind.
We waded into the dark legal thicket of family court, exposing how the Duluth model in Bavaria suspended the presumption of innocence and weaponized female victimhood for state control.
We deconstructed the economic extraction matrix, using the government's own CONSAD study to shatter the 77-cent wage gap myth, revealing how the state engineered itself to become the institutional husband.
And finally, we arrived at Riker's radical call to action. The latent veto, the reclaiming of the Logos Force triad, and the uncompromising demand for men to build decentralized parallel meritocracies.
It is a sweeping, ferocious, incredibly dense critique of the modern world. And again, to you, the listener, these are Conrad Riker's polarizing, highly controversial views laid out here impartially for your own evaluation.
We just presented the arguments.
Exactly. We want you to think critically about every single concept we've unpacked today. If you were fascinated by this breakdown, if you want to read the source material for yourself and examine the architecture of these arguments firsthand, which we highly recommend, you absolutely need to check out Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books to buy Devil's Advocate.
And make sure you follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack. That is conradriker.substack.com, and you can find him on X and YouTube.
For sure.
There is a massive amount of historical and legal data to digest there, and going to the primary source text is always the best way to grasp the full, unvarnished weight of his argument.
And as always, do not forget to like and subscribe to our channel right now so you never miss one of these deep dives. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Something that builds on Riker's text, but perhaps challenges his utopian vision for the future of these male networks.
Okay, let's hear the challenge.
Well, Riker advocates for men to completely withdraw and build their own unregulated, parallel, meritocratic networks based purely on logic and force, right? A new, untainted brotherhood.
Right.
But human history, that exact same violent Hobbesian history Riker cites to prove his points, shows that any successful network as it grows and becomes complex eventually requires administration.
That's true.
It requires rules, it requires governance to manage internal disputes, and eventually requires an HR department. So if these parallel mail networks succeed, and they grow large enough to actually replace the systems they fled, how do they avoid slowly mutating into the exact same bureaucratic, rule-bound administrative institutions that Riker claims currently oppress them?
A vicious cycle.
Exactly. Is a stifling bureaucracy really an inherently feminine trait, as he suggests? Or is the slow, suffocating creep of administrative capture just the inevitable, inescapable fate of any human civilization that manages to grow too large? Think about it. We will see you next time.